Let's get started. A warm welcome to everyone to the first of our three-part Monash University webinar series, A Nature Positive Australia, Why Does It Matter and How Do We Get There? My name's Anita Förster. I'm an Associate Professor in Climate Change and Environmental Law at the Monash Business School, where I lead Green Lab, our hub for interdisciplinary research on climate change and sustainability. And I'd like to thank Impact Labs particularly for their background support in organising and delivering this webinar series today. So I'll be moderating the session today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Monash University in Australia operates on the traditional lands of the people of the East Kulin Nations, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people. I'd like to acknowledge the deep and continuing connection that our First Peoples in Australia have with country, but also the historical injustices and the ongoing impacts of colonisation. And I pay my respects to the Bunurong and Wurundjeri elders past and present. I'd like to briefly set the scene before we move on to our three speakers for today. This is a really important time to be discussing the nature positive goal and what it means for Australia. Since the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was agreed in 2022 under the International Convention on Biological Diversity, we've seen a number of policy opportunities arise to address the alarming rates of biodiversity loss and environmental degradation in Australia. The Australian government, of course, signed up to the Global Biodiversity Framework and released a Nature Positive Plan at the end of 2022, which, among other things, sets out reforms to Australia's environmental laws and introduces a nature repair market. More recently, in June this year, the Australian government has released the Australian Sustainable Finance Roadmap with a series of reforms designed to manage the financial risks to business and the financial system posed by climate change and other sustainability challenges, and to help align private capital to meeting global sustainability goals. And of course, in a couple of weeks, the Australian government will host the first Global Nature Positive Summit in Sydney. So within all of these developments, and indeed more broadly, we're seeing increasing use of this term nature positive as an overarching goal and a target to guide policy interventions, to guide private sector initiatives to address biodiversity loss. Where does it come from? The nature positive goal was developed and advocated by civil society groups in the lead up to the 2022 International Biodiversity Conference. The aim was to have a science-based approach with equivalent normative force to the net zero goal that's set out in the international climate regime and has developed from that basis, to really galvanise responses to the biodiversity crisis across different levels of government and in the private sector. Now, the nature positive goal as a goal is not set out word for word in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but it's certainly reflected in its objectives and its targets and its framing. And while there are some differing formulations and interpretations, certainly the definition that's on the slide, which is put forward by the Nature Positive Initiative coalition of NGOs in the lead up to the 2022 conference, has certainly gained traction broadly. So this sets out nature positive as a global societal goal to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 on a 2020 baseline and to achieve full recovery by 2050. To deliver on this goal, it stresses the importance of measurable net positive biodiversity outcomes through improvements in the abundance, diversity, integrity and resilience of species, ecosystems and natural processes. And it reinforces that achieving this goal will improve nature's ability to contribute to human well-being. So in this webinar series, we're seeking to explore what this goal means for Australia, why does it matter, and how do we get there? These are really big questions, of course, and to even begin to answer them, we need insights from different disciplinary perspectives and many different areas of practice. We need the natural sciences to be able to understand what to measure and what to monitor, what counts as a nature positive net gain outcome in situations of considerable complexity. We need the social sciences to understand which behaviours, which actors we need to shift to achieve nature positive outcomes. We need law and regulation which can both be a powerful behavioural change tool, but also a barrier or a disincentive to change. Business and economics is really important, particularly when we're relying on market forces to try and achieve a nature positive goal. And Indigenous knowledges and perspectives are so critical to moving forward towards more sustainable relationships with nature. So this webinar series is a collaboration between a new network of Monash University researchers in the natural sciences, social sciences, law and finance. And in this series, we're aiming to explore just some of these different disciplinary perspectives and areas of practice and share some insights from our recent, current and ongoing research that's relevant to this question of nature positive. The first seminar today is focused on science, data and information for a nature positive Australia, and we have two more following: opportunities to strengthen law and policy for a nature positive Australia, and on Thursday, shifting behaviours in the land and finance sector. And I'll just move on, sorry. So I'd like to now introduce the three speakers for today. We have, starting off, Professor Melody McGeoch from the School of Biological Sciences, who will provide her reflections on the question of, do we have the scientific basis to measure and monitor nature positive outcomes? This will be followed by Saxby Affleck, also from the School of Biological Sciences, who will take this question in an Australian direction and look at protecting species and natural processes for a nature positive Australia. And then thirdly, Liam Walsh from ClimateWorks Centre, who will give the question a bit more of a practical application and look at developing science-based tools for measuring nature and supporting nature positive land use. So before I hand over to Melody, I'll just remind everyone we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the three speakers. Please put your questions in the Q&A panel and we'll come to them at the end. Thanks, Melody.
Yeah, Anita, and good afternoon, everybody. So as many of you will be aware, the period 2010 to 2020 was the United Nations Decade on Biodiversity. And the goal we set ourselves for this decade was to significantly reduce biodiversity loss. Yet it was in this very same decade that the evidence really first became clear that in most places on Earth, the extent and condition of biodiversity and ecosystems continued to decline. And this decline was happening at a rate faster than any time in human history. So while we failed very soundly, unfortunately, over the decade to achieve our biodiversity goals, what was achieved was significant scientific progress. And we made real progress over this decade on observing biodiversity and estimating and understanding how it's changing. And this progress that has been made sets us up really well to support nature positive. So we now have irrefutable and broadly accepted evidence for biodiversity loss. We have clear evidence for the way in which different facets of biodiversity, be it genetic, be it population or communities, are responding to global change. We also understand the root causes of biodiversity loss, and we've come a long way in understanding what the solutions are that are needed to reverse this trend. So here are just 4 examples of the type of evidence that we now have on biodiversity. We have evidence at a global scale on its threat status and the value of biodiversity. We have this information from many different taxonomic groups. And importantly, not only do we have this information at a global scale, but we have it at a fairly fine resolution. So we have it at the types of scales necessary to inform local scale planning. And it's not just information about threatened species that's important, of course. We also need information on the distribution of biomass across the planet. So for every unit loss of biomass, be it mammals, be it plants, be it invertebrates such as earthworms in soil, For every unit loss of this biomass, this brings with it a loss of the contribution of this biomass to a range of very important key ecological processes. For example, marine and terrestrial ecosystems are really the only sink globally for human carbon emissions, and together they sequester about 60% of the carbon that we emit. Nature, of course, underpins our quality of life. The unique aspects of biodiversity provide us with a sense of place. They provide us with inspiration and opportunities for learning, and with physical and psychological well-being. A very material example here would be the fact that 70% of the drugs that we currently use to treat cancer are either natural or synthetic, inspired by nature. So we also now have a very thorough understanding of what drives biodiversity loss. We know that the 5 main causes include climate change, invasive alien species, pollution, land use and sea use change, and direct exploitation in the form of, for example, hunting and fishing. The very largest and most immediate contribution to biodiversity loss comes from land clearing and the conversion of natural and semi-natural land to alternative land uses. So it's a consequence of this land use change that at the moment we know that about a quarter of the land surface area is less productive than it was 50 years ago. We also know that the loss of pollinators globally has placed annual crop production at significant risk, a risk estimated to be worth approximately $577 billion. We know that because of the loss of coastal habitats and coral reefs, between 100 to 300 million people living in coastal areas are at risk of flood and hurricanes. So it's really very clear from the scientific evidence that it's absolutely essential that we bend this curve of biodiversity loss and do what we can to achieve the nature positive goal. But I guess the question is, what will it take? So the figure you see in front of you is the output of some modeling of 2 future scenarios. And these are socioeconomic scenarios that looked at how future biodiversity loss from habitat conversion and degradation can be reversed, but at the same time, ensuring that we're in a position to feed our very large and growing human population. So there are 2 scenarios here. First of all, in grey, this is considered to be a sort of middle of the road scenario. And this is where the world follows a socioeconomic trajectory that's very similar to what it has done historically. And it includes the current trajectory of sort of conservation, investment, and action. The second scenario, which is the one in orange, is called the integrated action scenario. And in this scenario, we have very ambitious conservation goals, something along the lines of the nature positive goal. And also importantly, this scenario includes very strong coordination of efforts across sectors of economy and society. And you'll see from these figures that it is really only in the orange scenario or the integrated action scenario where forecasts show a recovery of habitat, of wildlife density, of compositional intactness, which is really a sort of a quality of habitat metric, and that shows a reversal of extinction trends at regional and global scales. So the 2 things that distinguish these 2 forecasts are the level of ambition we set for our conservation targets and the level of coordination. In terms of the coordination that we need, there are 4 key areas of focus that we have for being able to deliver the evidence to support nature positive. And the first of these focus areas is really comes with a change in thinking. So the thinking that measuring and monitoring biodiversity change adequately is just not possible. It's just too difficult to measure and monitor biodiversity change, and it's too expensive. This thinking has been completely turned on its head by technical and analytical advances over the last decade. So new technologies that combine many forms of remote sensing, visual and audio, molecular data, including eDNA approaches, and also advanced analytics and AI, mean that we are now able to efficiently and effectively deliver new information on biodiversity, orders of magnitude bigger in volume and quality, and at a faster pace. So at the moment, just to give you an interesting example, there's 6 teams of scientists competing, supported by the X Prize Foundation, to see which team can measure and measure biodiversity, measure the most biodiversity in a 24-hour period in the Amazon rainforest. Now, we all know that rainforest is a very structurally complex type of habitat, but it's also one of the, rainforests encompass some of the richest areas of biodiversity on the planet. So for those 2 reasons, they're really challenging habitats to document and monitor biodiversity. But this competition will really significantly transform what we consider to be possible for biodiversity assessment and monitoring by really demonstrating what can be done and which approaches are most successful and effective at delivering this information. The second area of focus that is biodiversity information and infrastructure. There's been really significant progress here over the decade in building the infrastructure and the methods and standards that we absolutely need to ensure we can draw together many different types of biodiversity data. So the Atlas of Living Australia is world leading in this space, and as Australia's national node of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility is really contributing to global advances to deliver biodiversity information to decision makers. Another very important development in the past decade has been the development of essential biodiversity variables. So these are a small and complementary set of biodiversity variables to be recorded, estimated, and reported in a standard way globally. Now, EBVs, or essential biodiversity variables, are conceptually similar to the essential climate variables that were adopted a decade earlier. And essential climate variables have really been instrumental in enabling accurate and consistent delivery of information on climate across scales to predict and mitigate climate change impacts. So EBVs are, in the same way, very important as an enabler for the efficient and effective delivery of actionable knowledge on biodiversity at global scales, at national scales, and at local scales. So these biodiversity information infrastructures, such as the Atlas of Living Australia, when connected across countries, across regions, and across thematic areas. So, for example, we could have a biodiversity observation network, and in fact we do have, of migratory species and or of invasive alien species. These form what we refer to as a global biodiversity observation system. And so the connection of multiple bonds or biodiversity observation networks into such a global biodiversity observation system has many benefits. And the question is, why do particular countries need to be connected to a GBIOS? Well, there are 3 reasons. So first of all, biodiversity has no borders. Biodiversity moves. It moves not only within countries, but across countries and across continents. It moves naturally in the form of migratory species. But biodiversity also moves with humans. So we know that emerging infectious diseases are often a consequence of the movement of material across countries, as are the many invasive alien species that we know go on to have very negative impacts on human health, on nature, and on the economy. Another reason why a global biodiversity observation system that connects national systems is really important is because our threats to biodiversity also span continents, in particular climate change. And it really is the ability to draw on the power of global models for both climate and biodiversity that gives us the accuracy that we are going to need and the context that we're going to need to manage things locally. The final reason for the importance of a GBIOS is that strong international partnerships to co-design and build these tools and the methods alongside them is a much more feasible strategy than trying to do this as an individual country. And the benefits flow in both directions. So from global to local, we have the benefit of the predictive power that our global models provide in supporting local information delivery for planning. And from local to global, we have the delivery of new information that then feeds into the modeling. So enabling sort of a GBIOS really enables all countries to benefit from discoveries and advances in investment. Now, the structure for a GBIOS is already in place, the design is there, and individual countries and thematic bonds have already started connecting to the GBIOS. So thinking now back to those two scenarios and what separates them, the first point that separated the scenario in which we were able to successfully bend the curve of biodiversity loss from the one that didn't, the first point was ambition. And as Anita mentioned earlier, we have the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and this really does provide us the level of ambition necessary to achieve nature positive. So its 4 goals and 23 targets are ambitious, and they really lay the path for moving from a business as usual to a situation where we have ongoing increases in conservation efforts and more strategic and effective conservation efforts. But at the same time, they recognize how critical it's going to be to integrate production and consumption measures and to more sustainably, or to develop more sustainable production and consumption systems if we are really going to achieve nature positive. So the ambition is there. What about the integration and coordination? So there are a number of strategic actions that are well recognized to support the type of integrated governance that we're going to need to achieve nature positive. From a scientific perspective, this includes the research, technology, and innovation, some of which I've talked about. It includes the information systems and data sharing. Very importantly, it includes very clever implementation-focused strategy. So that's the science. But overall, we are very much going to need to pull together across policy, science, and society in order to achieve nature positive. And this is reflected in the scope and structure of this Nature Positive Australia webinar series that we have kickstarted today. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much, Melody. So next up, we have Saxby Affleck. Please take a moment to add some questions to the Q&A for Melody if they've come to mind during her presentation, and we'll come to them at the end.
Thanks, Anita. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. Wonderful. So in this next talk, I'm going to build a little bit on what Melody discussed in a more of an Australian context, particularly focusing on biodiversity and more specifically on why it's important that we understand what species are doing in ecosystems and the role that they play in maintaining these natural ecosystem processes and the contributions that they make to not only us, but society in general. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can measure and quantify the differences in these roles and contributions to develop some strategies that might help us to maintain, but also recover and prioritize natural processes and these contributions more broadly. So I think it's safe to say that most of us would appreciate that Australia is an incredibly biodiversity-rich country. If we look at the most recent State of Environment report published in 2021, Australia is home to over 500,000 native species, covering every single corner of the Tree of Life. Many of which, as I'm sure many of you know, are found nowhere else in the world. Over 90% of our frogs and reptiles and over 80% of our mammals and plants are only found here in Australia. And it's this rich diversity stems partially from the fact that Australia's jurisdiction captures an incredible variety of landscapes and ecosystems. As you can see here in the figure on the right, 7 terrestrial large-scale ecoregions are found within Australia's mainland and Tasmania. And these cover 89 more specialised biogeographic regions, each representing common climates, geology, landform, and species composition. And this, of course, doesn't include all of our unique marine and freshwater ecosystems. But as Melody mentioned, it's the same story here in Australia. Our biodiversity faces many threats. Assessments of Australia's biodiversity have shown that 97 species have gone extinct since 1788. 34 of these were mammals, constituting approximately 10% of our entire mammal fauna. Our legislation, our environmental legislation, lists over 1,000 species and over 100 ecological communities threatened. And these numbers are only expected to increase as species continue to face those threats of climate change, invasive alien species, habitat modification, and other human-driven disturbances. Importantly, we know, and has been shown in studies such as McGee and colleagues on the right, that these species extinctions are not uniformly distributed across the country. In Australia, we typically have the greatest extinctions in the more southern regions, and in particular on our offshore islands, raising particular concern there. But this erosion of biodiversity, especially here in Australia, isn't just about species, because biodiversity, by definition, captures many different dimensions. This includes not only the identity of species and their populations, but also the genetic diversity that they carry and the unique roles that they perform in ecosystems. In other words, their function and their contribution to functional diversity. And it's only by understanding this functional dimension of biodiversity that we can particularly begin to understand how to recover natural processes, the functions of ecosystems broadly, as well as retaining and enhancing the beneficial contributions that biodiversity make to people and society. But the real question is, and as Melody explained in great detail really, why should we care? Why should we bother sustaining and restoring these natural processes and understanding the role that biodiversity plays in this? Well, at large spatial scales, recovering biodiversity is essential for maintaining a safe operating space for humanity, to ensuring that our biosphere, the layer of the earth that supports life, is resilient and stable. Global frameworks, such as the planetary boundaries that you may have heard of, suggest that this can be achieved by ensuring that not only do natural ecosystem areas remain intact, with at least 50% of the planet's ecosystems remaining natural, but also ensuring that human-dominated landscapes can still and continue to deliver ecosystem processes and services to society. Unfortunately, current assessments of these two planetary boundaries do suggest that both functional integrity and natural ecosystem areas limits have already been surpassed, leading to potentially irreversible changes in planetary function. However, if we are to develop effective tools for not only maintaining functional integrity, but also recovering these functions, we need a sound understanding of what species are doing at the local scale. That's where it really matters. And we can often think about the roles that species perform or the contributions that they make from two perspectives. On one hand, on the left, biodiversity contributes to what we consider to be nature, for example, by dispersing seeds and nutrients through the landscape, pollinating plants, regulating the abundance of other organisms, or modifying habitat through actions such as grazing or trampling. But at the same time, we have to consider that biodiversity makes essential contributions to people and society by providing food and resources, or natural pest control services, or soil regulation in agricultural landscapes, or providing non-material value that enhances our health and well-being, such as being able to sit by a clean lake or go bird watching. But this importantly also includes the cultural significance of biodiversity and the many habitats that Indigenous communities, not only here in Australia, but all over the world, find very important and significant. So by maintaining biodiversity, we help maintain not only the contributions that nature makes to itself, but also to people. However, as you can imagine, no two species are the same, nor are they going to be equal when it comes to the functions that they perform or the contributions that they make. And one of the approaches that science has given us to understand and quantify these differences is by using the traits of organisms as a proxy for their functional roles. And by traits, what I'm talking about are those characteristics or features that determine how a species survives, grows, or reproduces. Such as for animals, we might think about body mass, whether they're large or small, their diet, whether they're more of a carnivore or a herbivore, or their activity period. Are they more active during the day or at night? And with these different traits, we can project species into what we refer to as a multidimensional trait space, as you can see shown here on the right for our 3 traits. In this space, every species is a point, and we can assess their differences and their relative position. But the real value of this approach is it tells us 2 very, very key pieces of information. First, it allows us to measure the diversity of different trait combinations within a particular ecological community. Excuse me for a moment. Let's begin that again. First, it allows us to measure the diversity of trait combinations and by proxy functions within a particular ecological community, ecoregion, country, or even the planet, which we refer to as functional diversity. And by maintaining functional diversity, we're able to maintain the health and integrity of ecosystems and the natural processes they deliver. Across many studies, across many ecosystems, it has been shown that communities with greater functional diversity tend to have more resilience and are more stable under periods of disturbance, although there are, of course, some exceptions. Now, the second key piece of information that this approach tells us is it allows us to measure the differences between species trait sets, a concept we refer to as functional distinctiveness. That is how unique a particular species trait combination is, and by proxy their function, relative to all other species within a community. In general, we expect species with very distinct sets or really high trait distinctiveness to perform unique functions, whereas those species with lower functional distinctiveness are more likely to have traits similar and by proxy functions similar to other species within the community, offering redundance. And from a conservation planning perspective, a focus on functional distinctiveness can provide a very valuable approach for deciding which species we may want to invest in for the purpose of maintaining functional diversity and by extension, these natural ecosystem processes. So here is an example. I've projected the functional multidimensional trait space for 508 Australian birds onto 2 dimensions, all of these points here, based on the traits you can see in the adjacent panels. As an example, we have 2 species. First, you have the masked lapwing on the left, and it's situated towards the exterior or the periphery of trait space. In general, we expect species on the outside of trait space to be more unique. And as we can see with the masked lapwing, it is more specialized in terms of its diet and its foraging strata. Therefore, the loss of this species is likely to have a greater influence on functional diversity. Whereas our other species, the yellow honeyeater, which tends to fall more towards the center of trait space, is likely to have traits similar to other species around it, so they may be able to provide some redundancy should it be lost or decline in particular areas. But as I mentioned earlier, Biodiversity is very multifaceted, and the traits that species carry isn't all that we need to consider when thinking about function and natural processes. The abundance of species also matters. In general, the species with the greatest abundance will use more resources, they'll have a greater influence on the environment, and they'll interact with a greater number of species, making an overall greater contribution within an ecosystem, all else being equal. Thus, it's expected that their loss and decline is likely to have a much more significant consequence for broader ecological processes. For example, Baker and colleagues showed that for a group of birds, 2,141 of them to be precise, with declining population trends and known population size estimates, 95% of total abundance derived from just 164 species shown by the dashed line in the figure on the right. For example, the willow warbler highlighted there has an estimated global population size of around 500 mature individuals, approximating to around 5,000 tons of biomass. Over 10 years, a loss of just 10% of these species would result in approximately 50 million individuals being lost and about 500 tons of biomass. Although this decline may not be very significant for the species or, say, an IUCN assessment, its consequences for ecosystem processes could be quite severe, especially if the species has a unique set of traits in that environment. And this is why integrating data on species traits and their abundance offers a powerful approach for deciding where we may want to allocate our resources in order to protect natural processes and species in combination. And our work has shown, when you look at all of the world's birds in relation to their range size and trait distinctiveness, two particularly important groups of common or widespread species emerge. The first of this group, highlighted in the top right of this figure, which are really important for functional diversity. These are common and widespread species with really unique sets of traits that have lost and not only going to have impact on ecosystem processes in the local communities that they live, but they're also going to reduce global functional diversity and that functional integrity I spoke about earlier. In the bottom right, you have a group of species that all share relatively similar traits, but because they're common, they offer a significant amount of redundancy and do a lot of work in terms of birds in the global planetary system. So we need to consider both of these groups for different reasons. But we can take this understanding of traits as a proxy for function and apply them in the context of, say, spatial conservation planning or protected area design. Our work has shown when you look at the communities at a 777 kilometre squared area, just arbitrarily across mainland Australia, what we find is that tropical and coastal bird communities typically comprise species with more unique traits and therefore more unique functions relative to other species in that community. Whereas in arid and inland areas, bird communities typically share more similar traits. So we really want to maintain function. We want to focus on those tropical and coastal communities because functional diversity may be important for ecosystem function and processes. Whereas in those arid centres, there may be more particular species that we need to think about conserving in order to maintain those ecosystem processes. But in light of all of this, as Melody mentioned, it's very important to consider the international cooperation that's required for this. And in the context of traits and functions, Australia plays a very important role in not only protecting communities and species that are very important locally for function, but are also really important for global functional diversity. Because functional distinctiveness can be calculated at different scales, in this case, the local scale just in relation to the species that occupy a particular area, and then the global scale in terms of the entire species pool, we find that certain regions, especially in the tropics, support communities that are not only unique locally, but are also unique globally. In other words, Australia plays a very significant role in supporting species and supporting functions that benefit local communities, but may also be important for ensuring that global biodiversity and global natural ecosystem processes are maintained. And I just want to end by saying that our goal for nature positive and nature recovery is very much centered on biodiversity. But biodiversity has many nuances and many dimensions that we've discussed today. And it's important that in our restoration efforts, we consider these nuances, especially this functional dimension, especially the traits that species have and the approach that this can benefit us in terms of understanding how species differ, how their contributions differ to not only nature and society, but the different feedbacks between these groups, so that we can conserve communities themselves, not just particular species that will benefit all ecosystems and societies. Thank you, and I'll hand it back to you, Anita.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Saxby. That was a great presentation. And I think from both Melody and Saxby, we have a great scientific basis. The next presentation will take us to thinking about the provocation that Melody ended with. How do you use these advances in biodiversity science in decision-making in the real world? So I invite Liam Walsh to present now and to talk about some real-world tools that are being developed to try and achieve nature-positive outcomes in practice. Thanks, Liam.
Thanks, Anita. And I just want to check you can see my slides properly. Great. All right. Hello, everyone. Great to be with you today. So yeah, my name is Liam Walsh. I'm the system lead for Food, Land and Oceans at ClimateWorks Centre. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the science-based tools that we've developed as an organization to support both nature-positive land use and also measuring nature-positive outcomes. And I'll get into explaining what I mean by that in just a second. But before I do, I just wanted to explain briefly a bit about who ClimateWorks Centre are and why I have a slightly different logo to some of the other presenters. So ClimateWorks Centre is an independent not-for-profit organisation based within Monash University, and our focus is really on bridging the gap between research and climate action and looking at how we can accelerate the transition to net zero, working with decision makers, so with major companies, corporations and financiers and others with decision-making power. And I oversee all the work that we do that relates to land use in this space, and also increasingly some ocean-related work that we're doing in Southeast Asia. So as mentioned, today I am going to be talking about some science-based tools that we've developed that form part of two programs that we have. One program that I'm going to speak about is called the Land Use Futures Program. And that's essentially looking at what changes in land use are needed in Australia to achieve a net zero nature positive future. And as part of that program, we've developed a particular spatial model that I'm going to talk to you about. And then the second program that I will speak to is one called the Natural Capital Investment Initiative. And that the work we're doing through that initiative and through some of the tools that we're developing there are really helping to assess whether organizational interactions with nature, whether they be major corporations or governments, are ultimately contributing to nature positive outcomes. But before I get into that, I just want to bring up this image again that you would have seen in Melody's presentation, because I think it provides a helpful entry point before I start to talk about some of our work. So as Melody explained, this is a visual, but it's really based on a study that was published in Nature and also forms part of one of the more recent WWF Living Planet reports. And the researchers in this case use a number of sort of models and scenarios to really explore how we might reach some of our biodiversity targets. And as Melody explained, the gray curve really represents business as usual. And as we know, this path will continue to result in the precipitous decline in biodiversity if we continue on this current trend. Now, to address this decline and ultimately see nature begin to recover, the research suggests that action is needed across these two broad areas. The first is sort of bold efforts to increase sort of the area of land and also ocean under conservation and restoration, as well as increasing the management effectiveness of these areas. So that is obviously going to be crucial. However, what they also said, and that that those increased conservation efforts obviously speak to the sort of yellow line there. to truly reduce biodiversity loss and see us move into recovery, we're really going to need to address the global drivers. And our global food system in particular is really, a significant driver of biodiversity loss globally. So we're really going to have to change the way we both produce and consume food in particular if we're going to arrest the decline and ultimately move into a more nature positive future. Turning to Australia, obviously as a nation, Australia has a number of different goals, but there are three particular goals that really sort of stood out to us and, really require attention. Of course, there are a number of Australia has a climate goal, so it's set a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% below 2005 levels. It is also recently committed to meeting the global biodiversity framework targets as well. But at the same time, we also know that Australia is trying to either maintain or significantly increase agricultural production. And as I explained earlier, our global food system is a major driver of biodiversity loss. So the question here then is it possible? Can we meet our climate goals, our biodiversity goals, whilst also either maintaining or increasing agricultural production? And that's ultimately what the Land Use Futures program was established to do. It was established to develop trusted analysis and advice on what a more sustainable food and land use system might look like for Australia, with the view that this would inform decisions and ultimately prompt action towards the transformation that we need. This is a program that's being developed in partnership with Deakin University, and with some research contributions from CSIRO. And in essence, we're exploring what a more optimal land use configuration for Australia might look like if we are to meet our climate, biodiversity, and agricultural targets. Now, at the center of this particular program is a model that we've been developing, what we believe is a world-leading integrated land systems geospatial model. And this is a model that ultimately identifies optimal land use and land management strategies in Australia. This model we've adapted. It was previously developed by CSIRO and was used to inform policy decisions previously. We have completely rebuilt this model and expanded upon it. At this point in time, the model covers the entire Australian landmass at a 1 square kilometre range and covers all of Australia's main agricultural commodities. And in a sense, it's a model that shows what sort of change needs to happen and where this change needs to happen to meet multiple objectives, and helps us to understand and manage the potential trade-offs between these different objectives moving forward. So there's a lot I could say about the model, but one of the things I did want to share was some of the solutions that we've integrated into the model. So some of the solutions include potential changes in land management practices that can take place, as well as the adoption of new forms of technology that can help reduce environmental impacts. And we've referred to some of these as more the supply side solutions, actual changes in land management. But the model also includes what we refer to as demand side solutions. So these are changes in some of the other drivers of biodiversity loss, things like our diets and also reducing food loss and waste, and can provide an understanding of whether shifts in that sense can help reduce impacts moving forward. So it considers a range of food system solutions. So how does LUTO2 support decision-making, or how can it support decision-making? Well, first, the LUTO model considers a number of goals or targets that I've made mention of that include, agricultural production, biodiversity goals, emissions reduction and carbon sequestration targets. There are a number of variables that can be adjusted in the model, and these include some of the solutions I've made mention of, so we can make changes to land use to land management practices, we then run this spatial optimization model. This then provides the basis for some really detailed analysis to understand, as I said previously, some of the opportunity costs associated with different forms of land use, and to really understand both the co-benefits associated with some solutions, but also some of the trade-offs that we're going to have to navigate moving forward. And the view is that we can use this modeling and apply it in a number of different ways, both in shaping government policy, but also influencing corporate practice. What I've got here is just a very early example output of the model, and specifically some of the mapping outputs that we have. So I appreciate that some of this might be a little bit difficult to read, so just explain a little bit about what you're seeing in this image. The first image is a map of current land use in Australia. So there's a 2010 baseline. And then on the right, we've run the model, taking different constraints into consideration, different targets, including climate and biodiversity targets. And then the image that you see on the right then shows the sort of more optimal land use configuration in 2050 based on the different targets, constraints that have been set in the model. And there's a couple of interesting things that we see. We see a significant increase in what is referred to as the use of environmental plantings. So these are plantings that are a mixture of native and local tree or shrub or understory species, to establish new and permanent forest cover. We see some changes in where cropping is currently taking place and how this might shift in future as the climate changes. We also see some changes in grazing systems, seeing the incorporation of things like agroforestry systems, so trees with livestock. And in some cases, we do also see some destocking of livestock in certain areas. Now, one of the important observations here is that if we run the model with a focus purely on, say, some of the climate solutions, so solutions that really just focus on reducing emissions and sequestering more carbon, we tend to get a lot more sort of monoculture plantings and a reliance on some more controversial solutions like bioenergy, carbon and capture and storage. Whereas if we include the biodiversity related targets, we get quite a different mix of solutions. And so the question you might have at this stage is, having sort of produced this model and run this model, can we actually meet our national goals and targets? What does the LUTO model actually tell us? I think the first thing to say is we're in the very early stages of ultimately applying the model, and there's still a lot of work to be done. But what we have found through our work is that there are a number of technological solutions that can get us quite some way. There are changes in land management practices that are going to be essential, but they in themselves may not be enough, and it may require quite large-scale shifts in land use if we are ultimately going to achieve our climate and nature goals whilst maintaining agricultural production. How we do this, how we achieve that big change and do so in such a way that ultimately benefits farming and regional communities is a really critical question, and something that we will explore in part in one of the subsequent webinars that we're holding in this series. And then the next initiative I wanted to quickly talk about was some work we're doing around the concept of natural capital. Just very quickly, because that term hasn't been used too much in the webinar to date. Natural capital is a different way of conceptualizing and thinking about nature that really draws to attention the benefits that nature provides to people. One of the challenges that we have in this particular space is how we actually bring measurability to the term nature positive. There is currently really a lack of consensus on some of the common metrics to measure genuine outcomes in halting and reversing nature loss. And so there's a clear need for scientifically credible, practical, and ultimately standardized metrics that are going to really bring measurability to this. But as we've covered, biodiversity in nature is really complex, so developing those metrics is a real challenge. But that's something that we've set about doing in one of our programs. So we've developed an open resource that we refer to as the Natural Capital Measurement Catalog. So this is an open source classification system for natural capital metrics and the associated measurement methods and public data sources. And it really brings all of these metrics, methods, and data sources into a single searchable online reference or resource. And this catalog has been developed by Climate Work Centre with input from a range of organizations. It's happened under the guidance of a technical reference panel of experts, but we've also had over 50 organizations ranging from financial institutions, government, land management, research, and supply chain organizations, all with an interest and expertise in measuring and improving natural capital. And the real goal here is to drive consistency in measurement so that we're very clear about what is being measured and how it is being measured over time. In terms of who will actually use the catalog, it actually is quite broad at this point in time because the focus here really is around driving consistency in natural capital measurement. So land managers, major corporations, the financial sector, potentially government, and also environmental data service providers all will potentially benefit from having this open resource and are likely to reference and use it in different ways. I just want to quickly give you a brief overview of the structure of the catalog, just to give you an understanding of how it all fits together. So the catalog is divided into two main sections, one for natural capital accounting and one for natural capital assessment. So the section on natural capital accounting is applicable for all entities that either own or manage land and really helps them to understand the extent, condition, and also the benefits associated with the natural assets that they manage. Whereas the section on natural capital assessment is applicable to all organizations that need to understand how their operations and supply chains both impact on and depend on nature. And the catalog includes a number of fit-for-purpose metrics for both of these uses. And these have been really reviewed by the technical reference panel that we have. Now, the catalog isn't a new framework or a new standard. It ultimately draws on existing frameworks. So it draws on a number of important international frameworks. So it draws on the UN system of economic environmental accounting, and also draws on the natural capital protocol and the emerging, or rather the now in place task force for nature-related financial disclosures. So it really brings content from some of those frameworks together. And in both sections provides users with an understanding of what to measure and how to measure it. And the catalog also connects to a number of publicly available data sources and tools. And as I said, the main focus here is really about promoting consistency between all the various actors that are already measuring or soon to be measuring natural capital. But as we know, that measuring nature is complex, but we hope that the catalog will really simplify that task by bringing together these publicly available metrics and methods. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be launching a new version of the catalog. So we're hoping to launch a new version in time for the Global Nature Positive Summit that's happening in the next 2 weeks. So we just encourage everyone to keep a lookout for that. And we welcome any feedback that there is on this next iteration of the Natural Capital Measuring Catalog. And then finally, just in closing, just wanted to come back to the, I think, Nature Positive plan that Anita might have referenced at the beginning, which outlined the need for faster, better decision-making, clear priorities, and also highlighted a number of data and information gaps that need to be addressed if we're ultimately going to see better planning, investment, and policy in this space. And we really believe that some of the tools that we've developed at Climate Work Centre can help better inform decision-making within this space. So with that, I'll maybe stop there and looking forward to receiving questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Liam, and thanks to all three presenters. We're getting some questions coming through, so I will start with those, and there's a few actually for Saxby to begin with. There are two questions. The first that's come through is, in making nature positive practical and operational, is there a way to describe a nature positive future state in ecological outcome terms, referencing Saxby's discussion about functional diversity and distinctiveness? So there's that question, Saxby, but there's another related question. when we talk about targeting functional biodiversity, what function does this allude to? Is functionality to support and maintain biomass ultimately for human benefit? How do we reconcile this approach with the loss of species that we've categorised as less functional or functionally redundant? So 2 interesting questions on your focus on functional diversity.
Yeah, brilliant questions. I'll start with the second part, actually, because I think that's quite relevant. When we're talking about function, the first thing we really have to understand is that everything is going to be important in its place. Where it is in its particular ecosystem, its particular habitat, it's going to play a role. So in essence, things aren't necessarily going to be completely redundant unless we're going down to an atomic level on things, but ecologically, things aren't going to necessarily be completely redundant. And when we're thinking about the support of, say, biomass is interesting because in general, everything will, and biomass can be a good proxy or a good indicator for the amount of function that something performs, as I said. But it's not necessarily the only thing that we need to consider, and it will depend on which, especially the discussion around functionality can get a bit vague in terms of which functions we're talking about. And this can depend on the particular context, the particular government, location, environment, or goals that are being set out in terms of what we need to target and which functions, and then say services or contributions that we're most interested in addressing or sustaining or recovering, for example. And I think that ties nicely into that first question, where if we're trying to operationalize this, I think as ecologists and biodiversity scientists, we've always had a fascination with indicators and these bigger, broad-scale measurements like species richness or functional diversity or genetic diversity that we can use to, say, model or understand the baseline state of these different dimensions across space. But in terms of a nature-positive future, we have the challenge of we don't really know how fully, or we're starting to understand how things are reassembling under these novel climates and environments and changes and things, and we have to understand those new baselines really. But then we also have the benefit of, as Melody discussed in her presentation, these essential biodiversity variables, which can allow us to develop a coordinated and international agreement on what we should consider to be a set of baselines for a particular area that would be considered, say, nature positive from multiple dimensions.
Thanks, Saxby. There's another question here which goes to scale. I might start off with a broad question about scale for all 3 of you, and then we could move to this more specific question. I'm interested in your reflections on what the best scale is to think about measuring nature positive outcomes. And that's probably a question for Melody and Saxby. And then Liam may like to comment in relation to the Luto model on, at what scales the model can think about these trade-offs between potentially competing or potentially complementary land uses to achieve multiple goals.
I'll have a bash at that. So, as I think all the presentations have illustrated, there's no single scale, there's no natural scale for the way the world works. Physical processes, climate, ecological processes operate across scales, and it's maintaining those processes across scales that is going to deliver nature positive. So how do we implement actions which are inherently scale dependent? And if one thinks about scale as a bit of a telescope, from global at the broad end to local at the narrow end, we are able to estimate multiple facets of biodiversity, be it richness, be it function, be it even genetic diversity increasingly. We're able to estimate those values at local scales from global models. And we're able to, using physical models such as climate, predict how those local scale biodiversity properties are going to change under various scenarios. So what we need to be doing is building prioritization models that take current land management practices, let's say at 100 by 100 kilometer scale. In my head, that's the scale of a landscape. It could also be sort of natural land use boundaries, but we need to be prioritizing for those land area units based on the broader context of what we want to be achieving at a national scale. And there are worked examples, some of which I think Liam is captured in some of the work that Liam's doing. So they're real world examples of how we prioritize what actions need to be implemented in particular local areas in order to not only contribute to protecting biodiversity within that unit, but also simultaneously contributing to achieving those goals at broader scales. So it is possible. I know it sounds complicated, but it's been done before in slightly different contexts and with slightly different approaches. And as I mentioned in my talk, we have the science available to do this. We need good coordination across scientists in different areas, but also across government and civil society to pull this off.
Thanks, Melody. Liam, would you like to comment from the perspective of your work?
Sure. I mean, the only thing I'd add to what Melody said is, and thinking specifically about the Luto model. So the Luto model was really developed with the view that it was going to be applied at a national scale. And whilst it has this fairly fine scale resolutions that can go down to kind of the square kilometer, we do need to be very careful about, when we get down to that level of resolution, just, what sort of predictive capacity the model actually has. So yeah, a tricky one to answer, to think about what is the right scale. But yeah, for the case of the Luto model, we really are looking at this at a national scale.
Right. There's a question/comment here that downscaling nature positive at the lot scale remains problematic, as the impact is often determined as small, yet contributes to death by 1,000 cuts. So those kind of cumulative impacts that are so difficult to address and regulate. Do any of the presenters have insights or examples where nature positive policy and practice is being used by planners in cities?
Yes, there's certainly significant advances in this area in terms of implementation in cities across Europe. In an Australian context, specifically relating to water, but including biodiversity and sort of riverine biodiversity, for example, the Water Services Association of Australia has an incredibly fantastic, I think, strategy and policy documents in this area. And within it, there are a number of case studies of sort of local community areas, local governance areas in cities and in rural areas, and how they've sort of taken on board nature positive and how they're moving forward to contribute to addressing this bigger goal.
Great. There's one question here that really focuses on achieving climate and nature targets together. So I might start off with a broader question for you all, and then we could move to this more specific question. And Saxby particularly mentioned at the end of your talk, I think, the shifting baselines, the novel ecosystems that we are likely to see more of as climate change progresses. And I wanted to hear your reflections, I guess, Melody and Saxby, on how we deal with the uncertainties posed by climate change when we're thinking about how to understand and measure and quantify nature gains and losses, and ultimately a nature positive type outcome.
So both climate, so what species have three options when it comes to climate. They die, they adapt, or they move. And it could be some combination of those things. So We have some understanding of how particular species are likely to respond. We have some general understanding of the directions in which species are likely to move. But what we do know is that we're going to be dealing with new combinations of species moving forward. And, you know, ecology as a field and biodiversity science as a field have some very valuable general rules and theories that allow us to predict and sort of understand the consequences of those changes in community composition, which is what we call it. So what we need to do is sort of future-proof our policy and action to accept the fact that species combinations are going to look different, and where we have particular objectives that really have a requirement for high priority conservation of particular existing communities, then we need to start looking at sort of more amelioration type approaches. So it could be tree planting to increase cover and shade, and so on. But again, it boils down to that spatially explicit, integrated planning to prioritize which actions are going to be most useful and most appropriate and most future-proof in a particular physical locality.
The only thing I'll add to that is I think it comes from the perspective of, say, functional services, or the contributions that these communities produce now and these novel compositions will produce in future. I guess it's a question of what we're willing to tolerate and whether these novel assemblages will be able to deliver the services or contributions that we need for society, but also to keep these ecosystems functioning healthily themselves. And we need to understand that uncertainty better as in terms of what these novel compositions are going to deliver, or, you know, we lose everything moving north, whether our tropics are going to deliver the same services that they have in the past.
And I might like to just also follow on from that and say that intact communities are more resilient to climate change than disturbed communities. So by restoring, rehabilitating, and protecting intact nature, we are simultaneously giving ourselves a brighter future in terms of the extent of intervention we're going to be forced to take to manage climate change, because we're better positioned to do that when we do have more intact nature than when we don't, that we know.
I'm also happy to add, Anita, this is something that we try to address through our work on the Luto model. So we know that habitat suitability is going to shift with time. With climate models in particular, you know, becoming better, we have information available that in a sense allows us to model as best we can, predict just how that habitat suitability will change. And so that's a particular aspect or feature within the Luto model. It actually, as best we can, tries to cater for the fact that, you know, species are going to have to move as the climate changes, and particularly as warming takes place. So that's something, it's a specific aspect within the Luto model that we're looking at.
Right. Maybe just to follow on from that, Liam, there was a question in the chat here, particularly about understanding trade-offs between meeting climate and nature targets, and the kind of question of whether you end up with uneven adoption, I guess, you know, more focus on carbon sequestration than biodiversity conservation, or vice versa, and whether you could speak to that and how you're, you know, conceptualizing and approaching those difficult issues with the modelling, what basis the model can give for decision makers to understand and deal with those trade-offs. Yeah,
that's definitely a very real world concern. I think we've seen in other parts of the world, I think there are examples, even New Zealand, where in a sense, a narrow focus on climate mitigation can result in some quite perverse outcomes, both for people and for biodiversity. There are multiple factors for this, but in certain parts of the world, we're now seeing land managers transition away from, say, the the sort of livestock production or keeping sheep, and instead transitioning to sort of high value pine plantations instead, because of some of the incentives that are being offered through policy. And so we do need to be very, and of course, you know, some of these developments, some of these monocultures really, you know, have quite severe impacts on biodiversity. So it really is important that we are thinking about both how do we meet some of our mitigation objectives, some of our sequestration objectives, but doing so in such a way that, you know, it doesn't actually cause harm to biodiversity. So that's something very specific that we've looked at as part of the modeling, and, you know, sought to include all of the global biodiversity framework targets as part of that. And as I explained in the presentation, depending on which targets and goals you include, you know, the mix of solutions that the model ultimately prioritizes changes. And then how you sort of navigate those trade-offs is, you know, the question moving forward, right? But, you know, I think the important thing here is that there are, you know, there are some solutions that provide sort of co-benefits, right? With the potential not only to support better mitigation, but also have better biodiversity outcomes at the same time. So yeah, it's just how that we sort of realize and prioritize those solutions. That's really important moving forward.
Great. And we'll begin to think about some of those questions in some of the next webinars as well. We probably have time for one or two more questions. I think there's a good one here for Melody, probably to begin with. Are there any distinctions between the kinds of metrics that need to be developed to document nature positive actions compared with the kinds of metrics that have been used to document ecological degradation in the past? What in your minds is new here other than the specific justification for why measurement is necessary?
I mean, that's a very good question, and I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel in many instances. What we do need to do is try to choose measures that are deliverable as readily as possible and at multiple scales without shying away from some of the more complicated things. So, you know, land use, land type, all the sorts of things we get from remote sensing are a bit of a no-brainer and a very valuable contribution to reporting. And then, you know, that tells us about the distribution of primary productivity and all that sort of thing. That's all really useful, and it's certainly been used a lot before. Then, you know, the indicators underpinning the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, many of those have been used before, and they should be used in the same way and updated. Some of those are very useful at a national scale. Some of them are reasonably useful at fine scales. So I'm sorry I'm not giving a very specific answer to that question because there isn't one, but I think the general point is that many of the things we've been measuring to date remain very useful. The importance is to supplement those with a complementary set of measures that gives us the broader picture of biodiversity change that we really need to know about and that we've neglected in the past. So we've had this real focus on threatened species and only on protected areas. We really do need to scale this now across multiple measures of biodiversity and all land use areas, not only protected areas.
Great, wonderful. Well, we might wrap up now because that's that for most of the questions. I'll just finish with reminding people that we have 2 more webinars in this series. So please join us next week on Monday and Thursday to delve into some of the legal and policy issues around nature positive and to think about behavioural changes particularly in the land and finance sector as 2 sectors that are really critical to achieving a nature positive Australia. The presenters in this series are all part of a new network that we're developing at Monash University, Monash Nature Positive Network. You can find some information about that network on the slide. The address is there. And contact details for the presenters are also on the slide. So thank you very much, Melody, Saxby and Liam, and thank you very much to our audience for your questions and your participation. And we hope to see you next week.